We are live. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you're coming from. Today, I have this very, very special guest. This is my son,
Hi,
Horel,
everyone.
and we're going to have a very interesting conversation today. But before we start, why don't we get to know you a little bit, Horel? Can you just share a
Sure.
little bit about yourself, and then we're going to jump into the topic of the day?
Great. So, my name is Harel Friedlander. I am a hacker. I'm a penetration tester and a security researcher and a bug bounty hunter in my free time. I started hacking when I was 14. I was still a script kiddie. Was doing some Wi-Fi hacking and stuff like that. And then around when I got to high school, I got really into CTFs. Started playing a lot, building my skills. When I was in high school, I hacked um, my school's information system. Actually, that's how I got one of my first jobs in cybersecurity as a security researcher there, and I gained a lot of experience there, and really specialized in web application testing. And now I'm doing penetration testing and bug bounty hunting. I've hacked quite a lot of big companies. Hacked Glassdoor, which I've done a research on, was actually nominated for one of the top 10 techniques in 2022. It was a very cool technique of web application of web cache poisoning with parser confusions. It's pretty neat if you want to check it out. And recently, some really cool companies. I'm not allowed to disclose, but one is a big AI company, and the other is a meeting company. So hopefully, write up on that in the future. But yeah, that's a
Cool.
little bit about me.
So yeah, I think that's going to be a great topic maybe for future sessions. We can you can sort of share how you got into it a little bit more and give
Absolutely.
other people some advice how to get into cybersecurity. So we had a discussion the other day, and I was sort of amazed how easy it is for you, and you actually enjoy it. You told me,
Yeah,
whenever there is a WAF, you're like, oh, cool, it
it's
makes
fun.
my
Makes
payload cooler.
it makes my
Yeah.
payload cooler. Exactly. Yeah.
And I was like interested, okay, so let's deep dive and explain to me what's going on and how you're doing it. And it was very interesting. And I thought we can, have this discussion on live and share with others. But for those who don't know what a WAF is, can you maybe just like in one sentence, two sentences, sort of share what it is, what it's supposed to do, and then we're going to talk about how you overcome it.
Yeah, sure. So a WAF actually stands for Web Application Firewall, and it does exactly what it sounds like it does. It's supposed to protect you from web attacks. That being stuff like OWASP top 10, any injection vulnerabilities, and DDoS and stuff like that. So
Cool.
that's pretty much it.
So, if it's supposed to do all of that, right? How come it's so easy for you to bypass them? Like I've
Yeah.
hardly ever heard you, struggling, really struggling with any web application firewall. Like what's going on? Like why is it relatively easy?
Yeah. So thing about WAFs is, um, well, they're trying to protect you, right? And by that, you need to block requests. And we're going to get into that later, but WAFs are missing a lot of context. So it's trying its best to say what's malicious and what's not. And it's very hard to differentiate between legitimate user input and malicious user input. So it's really trying its best and trying to find the right balance between letting through things in and letting and blocking certain things. And I mean, if you want it to be 100% protected, you just block every single request. But obviously, that's not realistically possible. So you need to find sort of a middle ground between what's malicious and what's not. So
And
that's what WAFs are attempting to do.
so you spoke to me about, the difference between detecting a vulnerability and exploiting it.
Right.
About sanitizing. Can you sort of like, explain that and give maybe an
Sure.
example?
Yeah. So what a WAF isn't supposed to do is patch your vulnerability, right? Um, it attempts to detect vulnerabilities instead of trying to actually sanitize them like you would if you were to actually fix a vulnerability. And I'm talking specifically about injection vulnerabilities right now. But a WAF is not supposed to fix your vulnerability, right? So this means that if I were, for example, to try to detect a vulnerability, like let's say, for example, an XSS vulnerability, right? I would try to see if there is sanitization on the server or not. And the way I do that is not by going and giving it an actual XSS payload, right? Because that the WAF will see, hey, that's a payload, I'm going to block that. The way I would do that is actually, putting special characters that I know I need in order to make myself an XSS payload. And that would be like, just quotes and less than greater than signs and certain special characters like that, which by itself is not really malicious, right? You use these characters all the time, like in emails and comments, whatever. Like these are characters that you need to.
Like quotes, like people
Yeah,
want to
exactly.
quote,
Like
you know,
you
like
use quotes all the time, or like less than greater than, not really like, oh,
right.
this is more than that, whatever. So a WAF can't block that, right? If it blocks that, then we get to the point like, it needs to balance what's legitimate and what's not. And that is why it's so hard to do. So the way that I personally go about detecting vulnerabilities is by manually seeing if these characters are actually reflected or not. And because these are, innocent and no WAF ever is going to block just, only these characters, it's very easy to detect them. The issue comes when you're trying to exploit it, and that's what a WAF is attempting to block. A WAF is looking at the payload as if you were looking at it in your eyes, right? Imagine the WAF had eyes, right? If it looks in your payload and it says, "Oh, this is obviously an XSS payload. It's obviously trying to, steal my cookies and send them over to a malicious server," I'm going to block that. Or even as simple as, injecting a script tag, and that suggests that you're trying to run JavaScript. So pretty much, a WAF tries to look at it and tells if it's malicious, sort of like by eye. It's not trying to sanitize. If you were to sanitize your user input, then you would encode these special characters and you won't necessarily block them, right? You let it through, but you will encode it safely like you're supposed to do.
So basically what you're saying, in other words, if I have to summarize this,
Mhm.
so you send a character that is not necessarily malicious by itself,
Mhm.
like the greater sign, the
Right, sure.
quotation and
Yeah.
stuff like that. It's still not part of a script. It's just
Mhm.
like a character.
Yeah.
And if you detect a vulnerability, for example, that the code didn't sanitize this parameter, by looking at how it's reflected back, you can see, okay, it wasn't escaped
Yeah.
or anything like that. Then okay, the developer didn't sanitize
Yeah.
the parameters. So
Right.
now okay, there's a vulnerability here for sure.
Yeah.
Now what I need to do next is to exploit it. So
Yeah.
let's talk about that part. So, okay, you found a parameter that is not sanitized or in a proper way. And like you said, the WAF is looking for an exploit, right? They're looking for that script. So how do
Mhm.
you overcome that gap? Because you want to exploit it. You don't just want to find a vulnerability. You want to actually to
Mhm.
exploit the vulnerability. How do you bypass that part?
Yeah. So I just try to like talk to the WAF. I try to
Okay.
see what it likes and what it doesn't like. So I start off with as basic of a payload as I can. I don't try to bypass anything. Um, Not even a payload. I go with something that I know the WAF will block. For example, a script tag. Let's say that, right? Let's say my user input was reflected within a JavaScript context. I want to, put in a closing script tag. I know that the WAF will probably, block that. Most WAFs block that. So I try to see what does it not exactly like about the script tag, right? Is it if it's complete? So like I try to like, delete a character, see does it like this, does it not like this? So I do like an incomplete script tag, for example, something which if I had more input, I would be able to complete. And I try to find the line where the WAF says, okay, this is okay and this is not, and I work around that, right? So this can be in several ways. The WAF doesn't really consider the context of the web application, so I can use certain quirks that happen a lot to break down the payload in a way that will confuse the WAF. Other times, it's simply just a different tag that I can use with certain attributes. And I sort of just play around with it and try to talk to it, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. And eventually, more often than not, I find a way around it, right? Like, I can give you an exact number of what I would estimate around like 70 to 80%, maybe even more of the time. I can bypass it with no problem. And it's actually pretty fun because it's a bit of a challenge. It's more than just putting a script alert one that kind of sucks, and it makes my payload look sometimes really really cool, right? It's like it's like you show it off to your friends and are like holy crap, like this is like this looks sick, but it's just a WAF bypass really with a simple XSS payload. So
Cool.
yeah.
So you also said that even if a WAF would be 100% configured, let's say it's configured to the T, like they did an amazing job, like extremely amazing job, the best WAF configuration ever. Still, there's a huge category of web attacks that can just, go through the front door through this WAF because it's not really meant or it can't really detect them. And those
Right.
are some of the major ones. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, of course. So those would be logic bugs, authorization bugs, authentication bugs. Specifically, let's take a specific example. The most common vulnerability you see nowadays, probably like even more than XSS, would be iDoors, right?
Right.
And iDoors by themselves, they look innocent, right? You look at an XSS payload, like, okay, that's obviously an XSS payload. You look at an SQL injection payload, you say that's obviously an SQL injection. But you look at an IDOR and you just see a normal request requesting, I don't know, something like from the API, like for example, settings, or I don't know, credit card information like it's supposed to, but from a different ID. And since the WAF doesn't have the context of the application, it doesn't really understand the logic, then it's almost impossible to say, if this is an IDOR payload or not. What it is, it's abusing the fact that there is, missing authentication, there is missing authorization. You're just literally, if you could rename the IDOR, because IDOR is a complicated name, you can just say ID substitution, right? You're you're substituting an ID for a different ID, and you're getting someone else's information. It's as simple as it gets. The most simple vulnerability, in my opinion, and it's just no fun in my opinion because I like things that are a little bit more complex than that. But it's so common, and not just IDORs, by the way. Like you have an entire class of API vulnerabilities. Logic vulnerabilities, which the WAF just cannot detect. And that is an entire missing attack surface that the WAF won't really protect you against.
Yeah. So when we read that, okay, WAF takes care of the OWASP 10, that's like a little bit overrated, let's call it that way, just to not...
Yeah, I mean, it even if it did, even if it attempted to block IDORs and stuff like that, like it does, it attempts to protect you. It doesn't protect you, it attempts to, right? If you were to deal with an actual persistent attacker who cares about bypassing your stuff, like he will, there's no way around it.
Gotcha. So okay, so we're talked about the weaknesses. So what is it good for? Because everybody's using it. So like there has to have, there has to be an advantage of using like a WAF.
Yeah. So like I said before, let's get it out of the way again. If you're dealing with someone who's manually going to look at your application, any attacker with a little bit of experience will be able to bypass it eventually. Like more often than not, they'll be able to bypass it. They're specifically targeting you, right? However, most of the attackers that you will see are just automated scripts, scanners, and bots. And your script kiddies here and there don't really know what they're doing. So the WAF will probably be effective in blocking those, right? And obviously, you're trying to integrate some WAF bypasses, but the WAF is going to catch them all. And that is personally why I'm not a big fan of these types of scanners, because I just do so much of a better job myself manually. So a WAF is good at getting rid of those attackers, those low level attackers, and DDoS, stuff like that. DOS, those you'd have to configure it as such, but it can definitely help you with stuff like that.
So you mentioned back then that it's, one thing that I like that you said, it's like it gets rid of the tire kickers of
Right. Yeah.
the,
It gets rid
of the noise
of the attacker world. Absolutely.
So when you're looking for a needle in a haystack, it basically shrinks the haystack significantly, and allows you more to focus on the more sophisticated attacks and the ones that probably you would have not seen because of the noise.
Yeah.
So that's what I remember that you were. I like that. I like that the haystack idea. So what do you think companies need to do in order to protect themselves against web attacks? Like,
Yeah,
what do you see usually when you're like, okay, this is too hard? Like,
yeah.
Why
When
usually?
you when you code secure, when you have secure code, like it's tough. There's no way of getting around it because your code is secure, so there's no vulnerability. You want to avoid having a vulnerability in the first place, which is extremely hard to do and is not realistically possible to have an application with no vulnerabilities. I can't expect that from anyone. But if you want to be secure, you need to try your best to actually follow good security standards, security best practices, making sure that you address all vulnerabilities, and that you know you code in a secure fashion. Don't confuse a WAF with good secure code. Don't ever as a security person say, "Oh, it's okay, we have a WAF." Like
Yeah,
that. If you say that, I'm gonna go attack your website because I know, since I can bypass the WAF, I will absolutely find vulnerabilities. Don't A WAF is an add-on, it's an extension to your security system, but don't actually replace it or somehow use it as an excuse for good code. So it's very important writing secure code and um, following all the best security practices.
yeah. And also on top of that, that maybe is it's another session for later. But you also have a lot of you were able to hack because of the complexity of the infrastructures that are deployed today. It's
Yeah.
not anymore just a web server and that's it. You have
Yeah.
cache servers, web servers, front
Mhm.
end, back end,
Yeah.
and a
It's more
lot of like
complicated.
back end and web services and APIs. And there are, even if I remember you telling me that even if each one of them is configured perfectly
Mhm.
from a security point of view, and you look at it, so your DevOps looked at everything and everything is like perfect. What happens is that the way they talk to each other
Mhm.
is the
Yeah. Partial
problem.
confidence. Yep.
Yeah. So like parser confusion, if it's, I think that's sort of like what happened with Glassdoor. I think it was,
Yeah. I'm not gonna go explaining it right now.
okay.
It's way too
Okay.
complicated. But I'll give you a different example though, if you'd like.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was recently looking at this web application that was using sort of like a gateway API
Yeah.
and forwarding all the requests to internal APIs. Um, and they were both written in two different languages, so the two different languages parsed the URL differently. And the gateway API was doing all the authentication and the authorization. So um, if you were able to bypass that and get the internal API, then you're golden. You have like no authorization or authentication on anything. So the way I was actually able to bypass that is by literally, like, it's crazy. The most simplest, easiest bug I've ever done is add a forward slash at the end, right? So the reason that worked is because the gateway API looked at the URL, it saw a forward slash at the end, right? So it didn't expect that and thought, okay, this is a 404. This endpoint does not exist. I will forward that to the internal API to deal with the 404. The internal API looked at it though and said, hey, like, this is valid. It's just a forward slash. It's not like an actual part of the endpoint. So I'm going to return you whatever you ask for. And that pretty much allowed me to bypass all of the authentication, all the authorization. And I was able to pretty much take over any user that I wanted to, do anything that I want with it. And like on a mass scale.
Yeah.
So these types of vulnerabilities, they aren't necessarily issues with the code itself, right? And it's very hard to like, you can't eye it, right? You can't look at it and eye and be like, okay, this is vulnerable. This is stuff that you have to test for. And this is because parsers in different languages are different, and this is a more modern attack that I see nowadays, where it's just parser confusions, like differentials in the way that certain interpreters are interpreting code, URLs, HTTP packets, all that types of stuff. So this is definitely something we can talk about next time.
Yeah. So I think, if you're launching an app, probably, WAF is a good idea to have. It, gets rid of the noise, allows you to focus more on the more sophisticated attacks or the manual attacks. Um, but I would also advise to code securely, have your team trained, sort of what we do here at Wizer. We're helping companies learn how to code secure. it's sort of a mission because of everything you spoke about. I think you just you can't live in a false sense of security that you buy a product that allows you to code in a non-secure way. And I would probably advise companies to have somebody review their code. So I think, there's different levels. Again, that's for another conversation, whether it's a pen tester, whether it's a bug bounty program, when do you do each? When do you invite a red team? Security researchers versus pen testers versus bug bounty. There's different levels, but at the end of the day, you have to have people that are actually testing your system. You have to have sort of like security QA for your app, and not live in that false sense of security that you just, purchased a product that will defend you. It's a good marketing, but it not necessarily works, and it makes it fun for you.
Yeah, no, it's very fun.
Yeah. So cool. And lastly, I think, like Avishai Avivi is saying here, take the time. If you do get a WAF, which we think you probably should, take the time to configure it correctly, because there are different levels of hackers, security researchers, bad guys, good guys. There are different levels. So if, for some people it's fun, for other people they will just move on to like an easier destination. So, take the time, configure it, don't just deploy it out there and let it go. Like, you have to maintain it.
Absolutely.
I think, that's it, guys. Thank you very much for joining. Harel, do you have any final thoughts, final words for at least today?
Sure. Just make sure that you're coding securely, I guess. Yeah.
Cool. So thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Let's do it again. I think we have a lot of other topics we can talk about. And until then, thank you all for attending. And until next time, bye
Okay,
bye.
thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye.